Am să-l invit pe domnul profesor Steven SWANN. Este aici în sală? Please, you are welcome. Where do you want to sit? Yes? Okay. Domnia sa este profesor la Universitatea Birmingham din Marea Britanie. Va avea o temă pe care, dacă eu o traduc corect în limba română, privește o analiză comparativă a efectului achizitiv al înregistrărilor de carte funciară. Îi mulțumim domnului profesor că a acceptat invitația Consiliului Superior al Magistraturii de a participa la această conferință din partea partenerului norvegian, dacă nu mă înșel. Și am să mă opresc aici cu introducerea. Domnia sa, dacă dorește să adauge elemente biografice pe care poate eu nu le cunosc, îl poftesc să o facă și îi doresc mult succes. Now I am giving the floor to you. Thank you very much.
Mulțumesc. which is as much as my Romanian will get you. If I could take this opportunity to say just a few things first. Thank you for inviting me. I feel honoured. It's not every day as an academic that I actually present anything to judges or future judges. So this is an honour for me as an academic. In my own country, they keep academics well away from the judges in case we might influence them. As regards my own biography, I think it would probably pale in comparison with many. But I suppose I do come to the law with the eyes of a reformer, having spent 1 year of my time at the Law Commission, the law reform body in England and Wales. So I think I have some sympathy for you in grappling with new material. I'm staggered at the depth of knowledge that you have to show in matters of civil procedure. I think many within the English system would sometimes struggle. You are dealing with law at the coalface, and I have a great deal of respect. So I hope that I'm going to meet some needs in looking at a comparative analysis of the acquisitive effect of registration in the land registry. I couldn't come here to tell you about. Excuse me. I couldn't come here to tell you about the Romanian law on land registration because, for obvious reasons, your expertise would exceed mine. But I hope I can give you a wider picture. And I think, or at least I hope, I can explain why you will need that wider picture. Not perhaps now, when you're preoccupied with the new civil code still bedding down, but perhaps in 10, 20 years' time, you may start to look wider to see how other systems are coping with similar problems. Now, I'd like to begin, if I may, with a quotation. And I suppose, being an academic, I hope it's not too impolite if I turn first to the words of a legal scholar rather than a judge. As a common law scholar, it's quite typical that we would turn first to a judge, but I'm being unusual in that regard. And with a nod to the support that we've received for this event from the Norway grants, I'd like to take as my starting point a cautionary observation from Vinding Kruse, if that's the name, if that's the good pronunciation of his name, who of course was not a Norwegian scholar. He was a Dane, but I think it's fair to say that he always tried to represent a Nordic tradition. And in the context of land registration, Vinnie Crusoe is a good person to turn to, despite the age of his work. It was his proposal for the modernization of the law which really transformed the Danish system of registration, including land registration, which was enacted in the 1920s. And that legislation, although it's been amended repeatedly, remains very much the backbone of Danish law, and indeed influenced the Norwegian law in the 1930s. In his seminal work on property law, he writes as follows: "The rules concerning real property are generally acknowledged to be a section of law where the special characteristics of the various peoples and their different conceptions of right are particularly noticeable. Therefore, this domain presents great difficulties for comparative legal study." Now, of course, Crusoe was writing more than half a century ago, when we had fundamentally different conceptions of property rights, visibly separated by an iron curtain. But it does seem to me that his observation was looking backwards as much as he was looking to the present. Indeed, he would have been acutely aware of the role played by different national traditions in the development of land registration. One of the reasons why Crusoe was called upon to prepare the ground for the modernization of Danish law was the reunion with Denmark of northern Schleswig in 1920. At that time, the Danes became confronted with the German land register system, Grundbog system, and had to adjust. It was time, as it were, to catch up. Now, of course, you'll all be aware that Romanian law in the new civil code has also made a leap, as it were, from one tradition to another. I hope I will show you that fits into a broader picture. Now, it strikes me that the Crusoe's insight still retains its vitality into our modern globalized age. Surprising, really, the almost universal adoption of market liberalism across Europe, tempered by various intensities of social control, has managed to leave profound historical differences in real property law intact. Swathes of legal norms have changed, as you know, but elsewhere, of course, in Central and Eastern Europe over these last few decades. And yet, traditional structures and concepts, many of them shackled during the communist era, not actually thrown away, they were sort of frozen but not completely lost. Many of those have, as it were, been revived or lingered on into the current law. I won't go into those now, but I do have some ready examples to support that. But they're not Romanian, so I'll leave those to one side. And despite all the political and economic integration which we've achieved in Europe in establishing a common market, real property law remains very much untouched by Brussels. What does that boil down to? I think it means this. Anyone who is foolish enough to venture a comparative legal analysis in the field of real property must sup deeply from many soups of legal history, each nicely spiced to suit the national taste. And as Cruz went on to note, the task is simply daunting, it's laborious, and not destined to yield results commensurate with the effort. Despite all that, I'm going to urge you to think about comparative law in relation to real property, not necessarily in an individual capacity, but to urge those who fund scholarship within Romania to keep that alive. should say on a parenthetical note, during the lunch break, I spoke to a librarian and heard the travails that she has in managing to keep a healthy stock of books. You do have, of course, a good stock of some comparative material, but we would always want more. Now, of course, this project is difficult on a European scale. We have so many legal systems, including member states within Europe which have several jurisdictions of their own, including my own. And we also have a great variety of languages, which makes it impossible to try to build a comprehensive picture. Many of the languages are simply inaccessible for us. And, of course, as I say, I'm cautious of the fact that I'm talking to those working at the coalface of legal development. I've heard you throughout today working at solutions, pragmatic solutions, different interpretations to resolve problems. So I hope you'll forgive me if I now commit two intellectual sins. Firstly, a sin of hesitancy. I aim to highlight problems based on my own insights, but I'm not going to recommend any solutions. I'm simply not in a position to do so. And you may have some solutions already in hand. If I can talk a little bit about prejudices that the British have about Romanians, you'll all be aware, of course, of various news about immigration stories in the popular press and politics. One of those prejudices is, of course, that Romania, not alone in this, but Romania and other countries in the south eastern corner of Europe suffer from problems of corruption. This, of course, is not a problem unique to this area of Europe, and most of the problems that we are experiencing in relation to land registration in England in the last decade have been associated with fraud. So there are lessons to be learned in both directions, perhaps. I suspect you have more experience of dealing with fraud problems than many High Court judges in England and Wales. So there are things to be learned in both directions. Now, for language reasons, I'm going to concentrate essentially on English law and German law, but from your point of view, that is slightly fortuitous, because Romanian law, the new civil code, has moved from a position closer to the French, the Romance tradition, to what might be referred to broadly as a more Teutonic position, jumping over, perhaps, the Nordic tradition in the middle. So I think what insight I can give you actually may be more profitable, perhaps, than many. Having said that, I should, of course, always strike a note of caution when it comes to the English legal experience. Vinning-Cruiser goes on immediately to comment that to most continental jurists, the English law of property seems to be an impenetrable jungle of national traditions and peculiarities. I will try to demystify as much as possible, and I would look forward to any questions I could help you with afterwards. But it always remains a difficult task. I think it's useful to start by thinking about the private law functions of land registration. Obviously, land registration performs other functions, particularly in relation to taxation, often has a very important role. But today, in terms of the acquisitive effect of registration, it's the private law functions that matter. I think we can refer to essentially two main functions. These could be broken down, but there's no need to do that today. Firstly, the issue of proof of title. By establishing a mechanism for registering ownership of land, the law makes it easier for an owner to exercise their rights of disposition. Registration of title, especially if backed by a guarantee from the state, accelerates the task of proof of title. It enables the person claiming to be an owner to demonstrate with ease that they are indeed the owner. They're then better placed to dispose of the land or burden the land in favour of another by way of some bargain sales, mortgages, whatever. From a comparative point of view, it's important to appreciate that that idea sits against a wider background of other rules on acquisition. The degree to which a purchaser actually needs the vendor to prove their ownership depends ultimately on the generosity of other rules of property law towards the purchaser. If the legal system has rules on good faith acquisition from a non-entitled party and applies those rules to acquisition of immovables, not something my jurisdiction traditionally has done, then the material need for a stringent system of registration is diminished. Similar points can be made about the rules on acquisitive prescription. Usucapion, for those drawn to the Roman tradition, or limitation of actions based on adverse possession, to use the long common law formula. Again, that supporting set of rules may often come to play to support those who are purchasing potentially from non-entitled parties. I think that combination of background modes of acquisition goes some way to explain why in Europe we have this spectrum of approaches. If you think about the Italian system, for example, its approach to good faith acquisition is relatively generous. There may be something in that. I think that's something for legal historians, not for today, but it's always something to bear in mind. Now, on the subject of acquisitive prescription, the English legal system almost received a bloody nose at the hands of the European Court of Human Rights. I'm not sure whether the Pye case has made its way, as it were, into the Romanian legal consciousness as well, but it certainly was a reason for changing the rules within the English legal system on acquisitive prescription. The point that was made very strongly by both the majority and the minority within those court decisions at the European Court was that the need for acquisitive prescription strongly falls away if you have a strong system of land registration. If you actually have title registration, the case for acquisition off the title seems to be an anachronism. That is certainly the general message. So this is something you may well confront further down the line. The more your system of registration in Romania takes on the hardened shape of an English or German system, the more you may have to revisit some of those other areas of the law that buttress it. The second area, or second set of functions rather, which are served by land registration is that which is common, I think, to all registration systems, namely to regulate priorities among competing interested parties. That may be looking at one or both of two types of relationship. Firstly, the relationship between an earlier and a later purchaser from the same seller. I think it's fair to say that within France, looking at land registration, that is the focus. That is very much the focus. More developed systems of registration are looking also at the relationship between a purchaser or acquirer and those who have existing limited property rights. Now, of course, the system of land registration is here performing a balancing exercise, balancing the interests of the marketability of land, its availability for commerce on the one side, and protection of those who have existing interests. The strength of registration is, of course, its simplicity. You are given a hook on which to hang your coat. If you have a limited interest, you can make other parties aware of that by registration. That's something we easily forget, but it's clearly the main strength of a registration system. Now, what you might have expected at this stage is for me to think in terms of the different styles of registration. Registration of title or registration of documents. But it seems to me that is the wrong way around to approach this. Actually, we need to identify first the functions our system should be performing before we think about the form it should take. That form also links, of course, to the fundamentals of the property law system. And we do divide in Europe between causal and abstract systems of transfer. Rather oddly, my own system, the English system, has a causal tradition for movables, but almost, say, an abstract, a German system for immovables. And perhaps, therefore, it's not just coincidence that both the English and German systems have very developed systems of land registration. Perhaps there's something there, a connection to the abstract system, which explains that. What significance can we draw from the fact that land registration must slot in to a system with a particular form of transfer rules? Well, if we take a causal tradition, one, as it were, that you are used to instinctively, then we expect acquisition from a non-entitled vendor to operate essentially by different mechanisms from those governing an abstract system. In an abstract system, the person who is sold first, in the usual story of things, has not yet acquired full ownership. So the abstract systems do two things. We see this vividly in German and English law. Despite their different historical roots, they do precisely the same. Firstly, they recognize a species of property right arising out of the contract. And secondly, they then protect it. It becomes a registrable commodity. Whereas in the causal tradition, this question doesn't pose itself. On the causal tradition, the first transfer the contract has transferred the ownership. It becomes simply a question of acquisition from a non-entitled vendor, good faith acquisition. So the very way in which we formulate these rules differs. So in moving from a system within the Romance tradition to a system where registration has a constitutive effect, as in the English and German tradition, these questions of contracts giving rise to rights, protecting a position before the transfer, will assume greater importance within Romanian law. That would be my first impression, that would come across. But it is not inevitable. If you look at the Austrian tradition, where you have again a constitutive effect of registration, you nonetheless have a weak protection of the inchoate owner, the purchaser, before transfer. So it's not inevitable, but I suspect this is something which will bug scholars as well as judges over the next decades. So as I say, in the hardened English and German systems, this is, as it were, now trite law. Within the English legal tradition, we refer to the estate contract as giving rise to a terrible thing, an equitable interest. I won't venture to explain equity to you today, but those of you who are already familiar with it have already, as it were, been bitten. In German law, more direct, we simply refer to that as an Anwaltschaftsrecht. It's, as it were, simply an inchoate right or a right of acquisition. Now, the further you move down the second set of functions, the more you may add to your system certain satellite functions, still within private law, but not traditionally part of property law. This can be seen quite vividly in the English legal system, although I think there are traces of it in the German as well. That is the tendency now to protect rights which are not strictly property rights, but are brought into the registration mechanism. In other words, we apply priority rules to rights that aren't actually property rights. In English law, this is done in respect of the rights of a spouse who is not him or herself an owner of the property. They have no rights of ownership in the house. All they have are family law rights to occupy because their partner owns the house. In a seminal case in the 1960s, the House of Lords decided that the rights of a spouse in this format could not be recognised as property rights, and Parliament decided for policy reasons, for social reasons, that was an interest that nonetheless should be protected. The mechanism for protection is simply to create something which is registrable. Not a property right, but it is protectable by registration. So, anticipate perhaps in the future, depending on how social and political policy develops in Romania, you may find your politicians hanging further Christmas tree baubles on your registration system. It's another development perhaps we might expect. Okay, if we step back a bit then from the English and German systems and think more broadly about how land registration operates within Europe, we can, I think, divide systems into three broad groups. And I hope, given my admiration for Romanian wine, and I have to say it's not very popular in Britain. I'm not too certain it's very popular in Romania, but I actually like Romanian wine. So I've indulged and given a wine reference: light-bodied, medium-bodied, and full-bodied varieties of land registration. In the full-bodied camp, we certainly have the English and German systems. Here we have a constitutive effect of registration. We have a system purporting to be title by registration, and that system is used to regulate priorities more extensively in the English system than the German, but the structures are comparable. Find, for example, interests recognised in English property law that Germans still keep at bay and leave within the contract law system. Options to buy property, for example, are property rights in the English system, as well as leases, for example, are property rights. Then I think it's fair to say that the Nordic systems particularly fall into a middle category. Here, registration is, in strict terms, not constitutive, but so many, as it were, bells and whistles have been added that we can talk of something coming close to that. There is a clear presumptive title. So whereas the full-bodied systems have that within them, this, as it were, is the outer shell of the Nordic systems, that they have a presumptive title. And again, they can be used to different extents to regulate priorities. Whereas in the very light-bodied systems, those particularly associated with the legal systems which have just drawn on the Roman tradition, we have more or less just regulation of priorities. That's essentially the role they perform. Again, anticipating the effect of the Romanian shift in weight, you might imagine that you are, as it were, scaling up, and therefore land registration, the effects of registration, may be felt in areas you've not yet expected within Romanian private law. If I may, then I'd just like to map out a little bit of the journey which English law has gone down, so that you can see perhaps how quickly Romanian law may be taking a pole position. There's much to be learned from what English law has done. I think you might think of Romanian law as wandering along a path behind perhaps the English and the Germans, who are stumbling sometimes in the dark. You have the opportunity to learn from our mistakes and not waste too much energy in the process. English land registration had a very bumpy start, lots of false starts in the late 19th century. As you can see from the dates of those acts, which attempted to create a voluntary system, which didn't succeed. So it was eventually replaced by a compulsory or semi-compulsory system in 1925, or by the 1925 Land Registration Act, which went through a continual process of minor amendments until the Act of 2002, which, it's fair to say, most English property lawyers regard as the best of a bad bunch. That's to say, it is the clearest of our property law statutes. It is supplemented by essentially regulation. The land registration rules are government-made legislation setting out much of the detail. What you have here, which is not your tradition, as it stands in the Civil Code, is to, as it were, split off general property law and land registration in different pieces of legislation. In the past, that has been a problem for development of English law. It's quite possible that mistakes were made inadvertently by, as it were, dividing up the two. But our Act of 2002 was in one sense less ambitious than your shift in the new Civil Code. You have really changed your system. All we tried to do in 2002 was improve an existing system. So the allocation of rights to the register, the limited rights, changed so that more should go on the register and less would float about in property law off the register. The extent of registration was extended. I think about 90% of English land now is within the registered system, but it only became compulsory in all areas of England and Wales in 1990. So actually, we have been pretty lazy. Bear that in mind. And finally, in relation to some rights, almost the rules of property law were changed in order to improve the system. But those improvements were not made in the remaining unregistered land system. So for our remaining 10%, we have still an old deficient system. We have simply not bothered to change it. Don't make that mistake. Make sure you have a coherent property law, even if you recognise not all land has, as it were, been dealt with properly in the registered system. In terms of what is registrable, a deliberate policy to extend the list down. Leases have always been registrable since 1925, but we have jumped now down from 21-year leases down to 7-year leases. It is even possible we might go down further still in years to come. Some leases will be registrable even if they're shorter than that for special reasons, such as the fact that they are not continuous. There are gaps in time within them, or they take effect at some time in the future. So we have, as it were, a scheme of registering rather complex rights which are not physically visible, perhaps, when you visit the property. That is part of the logic. But it is, and this is the crucial thing and the crucial twist that we have in Romanian law, it is a system which has a constitutive effect in registration. To give you a taste of the legislation, the relevant provision there from the Land Registration Act indicates that if a disposition of a registered estate or registered charge is required to be completed by registration, it does not operate at law until the relevant registration requirements are met. It is not easy, even for a native speaker, to grapple with, but is one of the more decipherable provisions in the Act. And if we look to the German provision, which I've translated, it's my own translation, we see essentially the same point being made in different language, that it is registration which is required and effects the change in title. Now, one could be forgiven for thinking that this solves all problems. The main difficulty that any system of title registration faces in relation to this aspect is transfer by operation of law. Title registration works brilliantly when we have a document to register. It doesn't cope well with death, for example. It may not cope well with bankruptcy. Both the English and the German systems at this point recognize that title registration and registration of title mean two different things. In the case of death, we have a divergence away from the mirror principle, the idea that the register truly reflects the location of ownership. That can always create opportunities for technical slips, and it can create opportunities for fraud. As I say, the experience of the English legal system, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, has been to bolt the door after rather nasty experiences. One of the most dramatic cases, perhaps of the last few years, I might mention, is where the fraud was taken to the level of impersonating a whole legal office. And they simply set up what looked to be, to all intents and purposes, a legal office. There was a letter-headed paper. It looked as if it was the branch of a London-based firm, and it was all fictitious. But once you have a system where one paper entry or one electronic entry changes ownership, it becomes a honeypot. And the more the registration system has sucked land in, the more organised crime will home in on that. A lot of the last decade has been devoted to shutting the door on fraud by increasing the checks which need to be applied. But these are things that you need to think about intensely in relation to a constitutive system of registration. That, in essence, I think is my main message. As I say, in relation to the English and German system, I can offer you some more detailed insights, but I'd like to give you an opportunity at this stage to pose any questions. I'm very conscious of the fact that late on an afternoon, after many talks on procedural law, land registration may not be the easiest to battle with. So I'd rather, if I could throw out the questions to yourselves and respond to those. That may be a good way of gauging your engagement.
Thank you. I have one question for you. Do you have only one registry in England, or do you have many registries?
Now, a very good question. The land registry in England and Wales is, as it were, a centralised structure. So there are regional offices, but it is a national institution with a London headquarters, where the chief registrar is based. So it's divorced from the courts. It's not a system of local court-based registration, as is the German system, for example, but rather it is a separate national institution at, as it were, arm's length from the government. So it's nominally under a ministry, but it is not governed on a day-to-day level by a minister. In that context, I can point to one controversy that has come up from last year, and that is the proposal that it be privatised. There is an idea that the current government has had that it should be sold off, and the whole thing dealt with, as well, like outsourcing, simply dealt with on a commercial basis, which is sort of going full circle, because the original idea of a land registry was it would be pretty much run like a business, paying its way through fees. That idea, I think, is not going to go anywhere, which is probably a good thing, because particularly when it comes to questions of fraud and accuracy, the last thing you want is perhaps a hurried group of staff trying to hit targets which are being sent by their managers on a profit basis. So I'm very much keen that land registry should stay as it is. Whether it would be more efficient dealt with locally is another good question, because where I've been talking about general property law, we also have a system of registration for local-based, local government interests, the local land charges, as they are called. Now, they are dealt with by local authorities. Land registry would like to take over that work and deal with it centrally, which, of course, local authorities are not keen on, but also, it's fair to say, local lawyers are not keen on, not because they actually do any of this in person, but more because they think that local authorities actually are very efficient in turning things around. So probably the status quo will remain as it has developed pretty much since 1925. But there are big political winds trying to save money left, right and centre, and it's often hard for those within the civil service to defend their position. I imagine many of you have a similar battle within the Romanian system, that money is tight, and there are always arguments about delivering things in different ways, which are cheaper but usually worse.
How did you manage to make the system compulsory and to register 90% of the land? Because we also have a law from 1996 to register all the property, and we didn't manage to do it by now. And all that is done already, it seems to have been done wrong. It does not correspond with the actual topographic coordinates. So how did you do it?
One is simply by force of legislation. The 1925 Act and now the 2002 Act contains triggers. So in the event that you sell your land or you make a gift or you create a long lease, you have to register. That's now required in order that the disposition has legal effect, that constitutive effect. And for obvious reasons, people have to comply in order that effect is there. There is another aspect which links to your point about the cadastral system. We have relied on the Ordnance Survey maps, which are produced for general purposes. Now, those maps are general guides. They are not scientific guides. Land registry, as a rule, are not concerned with exact boundaries. That also saves a bit of work. We are not registering plots at all. What is registered is an ownership, which has a descriptive plot, a map, but it's a rough drawing. What happens on the ground, ultimately, is what counts. So we've taken a shortcut. We've not gone for a traditional continental cadastral system. We are using existing maps and not worrying too much about exact boundaries. But there is a cost. There is a cost to that. That disputes about boundaries often occupy court time. I can show some even that I have still to read that are on my iPad here, very much concerned with these types of questions, what's in and outside the boundary when farmland has been partitioned. So the cost factor is shelved onto the parties when it comes to disputes, and the courts in resolving them.
I have a comment on this. In Norway, it's not compulsory to make. In Norway, it's not compulsory to make registration, but everybody does. And why? Because you can't get a bank loan. The banks do not give you the loan without having the possibility to register their mortgage. You get problems with insurance company. You can get problems with that the seller sells to another the same property you got, or that the seller gets bankruptcy. All these things means that nobody dares not to register. So I think we are about 100% registered.
It just reminded me of another reason why the English system has had a degree of success. I mean, they thought that they would achieve the goal pretty much by 1940. From 1925, they thought that would be enough time to get it done. But of course, that was pie in the sky, as we say, and it rolled on. But one factor that has helped, it's not that registration in England was needed for those kind of purposes, but because many of the big estates, I'm sure Downton Abbey is popular amongst certain class of viewer in Romanian television, those large estates, which were often divided up, the big house kept, but much of the land sold off or bought by local authorities, in particular the 1930s for housing. The 1930s was a big era of house building in the UK. And at that point, whole estates will become registered land. So it's when local authorities dealt with property particularly that it became registered. So it's a case of capturing things at the right time. Had land registration been introduced much later, say in the 60s, after much of the house building was over in Britain, we would be struggling.
If there are no further questions, I suggest to stop here. It was a long day. To thank you to Professor Stephen SWANN for his very interesting presentation. If you have the time and the curiosity to see one topic related to this one tomorrow morning, we are talking about a special procedure of registering in the land registry. You are welcome to attend. And to you, dear participants, thank you very much for your patience, for your involvement. Looking to see you tomorrow again. And I think that we can end with a big applause for Professor SWANN.